I've been an avid hunter since I was in middle school. Back then it was me, my little brother Jake, and our dad. If we had free time and something was in season, we were in the woods. When I turned 20, our dad passed from a sudden heart attack. Jake and I sure did miss Dad and all the time we'd spent hunting and tracking, but we vowed to carry on the tradition in his memory. As we entered adulthood, weekday hunting wasn't as easy due to work obligations. Come Fridays, we would always head out to the wild and stay off grid until it was time for work on Monday. Now, we tent camped when we would go on these excursions. It was a little more work, but it's how we learned and did it for years. I liked roughing it. I guess it makes me feel a little more connected to nature. One Saturday, during deer season, we were out like normal. It was a crisp day, but not too cold. Each of us would take separate spots in the area so we had a better chance of getting something. Jake didn't see anything all day. But around 2 p.m., I saw a buck that I'd been after for the last couple seasons. He presented himself broadside to me for that perfect one-shot drop. I was so excited that I radioed Jake right away to let him know that we wouldn't be eating ramen that night. He came over to my stand and helped me drag our protein for that month back to camp. After field dressing our prize, I cut off enough for us to have for dinner. The rest would be suspended from a tree limb a couple hundred yards away from camp to help keep the coyotes and bears away from us and to keep our meat safe until we were ready to head home at the end of the weekend. I started cooking the meat on a makeshift spit over the fire as Jake prepped some veggies and potatoes to go with the venison. As we both concentrated on our tasks, Jake stood up and stared off into the woods. I thought maybe he saw another deer. I whispered to him, "Hey man, you need the rifle?" He held out a hand, signaling me to stay quiet. I got very excited because I knew that a second one would feed the two of us most of the winter. Just as I was about to burst with excitement, Jake started walking away from the camp. I did a quick walk to catch up with him, and he stopped after about 25 yards. I said, "Hey man, what's up?" He whispered that he'd heard a weird noise, but couldn't tell what it was. He heard it a couple times before I caught up, but it stopped right before that. I didn't hear anything. Heck, the birds weren't even making any noise. So I tried to calm Jake's nerves and told him to come back to the camp so we could finish making dinner and relax before bed. All the way back to camp, my brother looked spooked. I've never seen him scared of anything like this. Usually he was the one who could laugh off anything menacing and go on about his business. Anyway, we got to the site and I told him maybe he should take a little power nap in the tent while I finished dinner. He agreed and went to lay down for a bit. While I was preparing a redneck gourmet supper, I decided it was a good time to sit and relax with my flask for a few minutes. It was a nice evening, clear skies with an almost full moon and no real wind to speak of. After some time in my meditative state, I realized that I hadn't heard anything from Jake. It was weird. Usually he would be hopping around like a kid on Christmas morning when I cooked fresh venison. So I forced myself from my comfy chair and headed to wake up old lazy bones. As I approached the tent, I saw that the flap to the front entrance was open. I poked my head into the tent, and he was gone. I thought, maybe he stepped away to water a tree. I waited a few minutes to take a wander out and look for him. After all, every man needs a little privacy when taking care of business. I guess that's long enough. Let's go see where this kid went. I wasn't too worried since we grew up in the woods and he knew how to handle himself in most situations. I walked for what seemed like an hour, calling his name every couple minutes. I started to circle around back toward camp, but on a different path to make sure I covered all my bases. I came to the mouth of a small cave that we hadn't explored in years, and figured maybe he'd gone in there looking for a place to think or something. As I entered the cave, I got my trusty flashlight off my belt so I could actually see something once inside. Gotta be prepared, you know. I barely got through the entrance of the cave and noticed a funny-looking mound off in the corner. I got a little closer and saw that it was actually a pile of bones. It was odd because that wasn't normal behavior for most animals that I knew of, to keep them all in one place in a huge pile like that. I took a stick and messed with the bones a little, trying to see what types of animals these were from. I saw some deer bones, small fur-bearing animals like raccoons and foxes, and some that looked a little like human bones. I had to talk some sense into myself. Come on, Dave, that's just dumb. There's no way those are human bones. It was time to head back to camp and see if Jake had made it back yet for dinner. All the way down the trail, I had an eerie feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary, but it was a haunting feeling all the same. There was no sign of Jake back at the site. I grabbed my rifle and truck keys and went out to check where we had hung the deer carcass earlier. As I made my way down that trail, I started to get that feeling again, only stronger now. And suddenly a branch snapped off to my left off the trail. "Jake!" I hollered. "Cut it out, man, that's not funny." But no response. I started walking again, but this time very slowly and more aware of where I stepped as not to make any noise if possible. Then, off to my right, I heard what sounded like slow, steady footsteps keeping pace with me. I stopped, and the other steps stopped. I started walking, and the steps started again. I kept pushing on. As I approached the spot where the deer carcass hung, I got my light back out. It was fully dark at this point. Even with the bright moon, I couldn't see any details beyond the silhouette of the path. I shined the light around behind me and to both sides to see if I could see anything moving. Nothing. Then I shined my light at the hanging carcass in the tree. I almost passed out right then and there. The deer carcass was gone. The rope was still hanging there, but nothing else. I shined the light all around trying to see where the deer was. I couldn't believe some animal got up there and took it down without disturbing the rope. I walked under the spot, right under the rope, and looked further down the trail. About 10 yards out, I saw a body on the ground. I thought to myself, well, ain't that something? That body was moved 10 yards from a hanging position, and they never even took the rope down. As I got a little closer, I saw that there was something not right about this carcass. It just didn't look right. I inched forward, trying to keep my nerves under control. Man, I really wish Jake was here, I thought to myself. Once I was within a few feet, I could tell this wasn't a deer carcass at all. It was human. I walked around the body while keeping my light trained on it. As I came around to the front, I saw it. It was Jake. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I had ever run in my life. I wasn't even sure where I was going at this point. My thoughts were all over the map. I couldn't remember where camp was, where the truck was, nothing. I just knew I needed to run. After a bit, the adrenaline wasn't enough to keep me moving anymore. I stopped for a quick breather while I tried to figure out what to do next. I've got to get to the truck, I said out loud to myself. Right after I said that, I could hear the footsteps off in the trees again. I shined my light off toward the noise and just caught a slight glimpse of something streaking through the trees. Whatever it was on 2 legs. I turned and ran toward my truck, hoping this thing couldn't outrun me. After a minute or so, I could tell from the noise that it was on the trail not too far behind me. I wasn't sure I could make it, but I knew that I couldn't let this thing catch me. Somehow I pressed on. The noises coming from behind me were a pretty good motivator. Suddenly there were sounds of footsteps on both sides of the trail I was on, along with the ones right behind me. I figured I was dead for sure now. It felt like I had been on the run for hours by the time I reached the truck. I jumped in and started that old Ford up and threw it in reverse to get clear of the trees. As I went to put it in drive, something hit the side of the truck bed with a loud thump. I looked in my rearview mirror and all I could see was teeth. I focused a little harder on the mirror and could see what looked like what people used to describe as Bigfoot. Sorta. It was definitely shorter in height, and those teeth. This definitely wasn't the docile creature that people have been telling stories about for centuries. As I made my way onto the main blacktop road, an arm crashed through the rear window and this thing grabbed at my throat. I made a sharp left turn onto the road, and the beast flipped out of the bed of my truck and rolled into the ditch on the side of the road. I wasn't stopping at this point. I found my way to the ranger station just down the road, and banged on the door until he got out of bed. He was totally shocked when he opened the door to see me standing there with a bloody neck and a rifle in my hand. Once I was able to convince him that I wasn't there to hurt him, he listened to my story in mostly disbelief. But to humor me, he said that we would get a state trooper to come out with us and check out the area where we had been hunting. By the time the trooper got to the ranger station, it was just about sunup. We drove to the spot where I had parked and walked into the woods. I thought to myself, I really wish they had let me keep my rifle. But they had no way of knowing if I was crazy or not, I guess. We found the campsite. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the deer meat that had been on the spit was gone. Nothing else seemed out of place. We made our way past the tent and down the trail toward the spot where I had hung the deer the day before. As we approached, I showed them the rope hanging from the tree. Then I told them that Jake's body was just up ahead on that same path. They told me to stay behind them as they pushed on. As we got closer, I could tell something wasn't right. I pushed past them, and there was nothing there. Jake's body was gone. There was just some puddled blood on the ground where I found him earlier. The ranger walked ahead a little more and found Jake's clothes just off trail. At this point, they're both looking at me like I had snapped and killed my own brother. As they began speaking to me in that, "Now just calm down," tone, something shot out of the trees and took the ranger right off his feet. The trooper immediately drew a service pistol and emptied his magazine. It was useless. That thing was way too fast. So we both started to run back toward the ranger's truck. We ran all the way without stopping. As we locked ourselves in, the trooper found the keys in the visor and got us moving. Again, one of those things slammed into the side of the truck and made it shake like we had been hit by another vehicle. I yelled at him to just hit the gas and don't stop. We made it back to the ranger station and called for more troopers and the Forest Service to send more men as well. As far as I know, they never found a thing. No monsters, not the bodies of Jake or the ranger, or even that damn deer. That was the very last time I went hunting, or anywhere near them damn woods. I miss my brother. It was the end of junior year. Summer was finally here. Sleeping in, swimming, and hanging out with friends. It was my idea of heaven. Everyone in our little group spent the first few days just making plans to fill the whole summer, including spending time with our boyfriends. The first weekend was coming up, and we all decided that it would be a great time to head for the woods and do a little camping. Now, my parents have always been a little overprotective of me and would never let me go camping with the other kids my age without a parent tagging along. Most of the other parents were fine with their kids going for an overnight trip with friends, but not mine. I needed a plan. I told my parents that I was going to spend that weekend at my best friend Sarah's house so we could swim in her pool and start working on our summer tan. They trusted Sarah and her family, so it didn't take much convincing. I hated lying to them, but I was 17 for God's sake. I needed a little freedom and a chance to experience life. I worked through the guilt and secretly packed my camping gear into my car the night before the trip. My boyfriend, Teddy, was also going on this trip. He was the love of my life. If it wasn't for him, I would have been swallowed up by all the teen drama by the end of freshman year. He really balanced me out. This was going to be the best trip ever. I drove to Sarah's house and switched my gear to her Tahoe. There were only 6 of us, so we all fit, even with all the camping equipment. We had a spot all picked out in the mountains, about a 5-hour drive. We passed the time singing along to our favorite songs on the radio and trying not to make Sarah too nuts as she drove. We finally arrived and set up camp. The spot we picked was perfect. We were at the base of one mountain along the river. It was like a postcard. There was plenty of room for all of our tents and the fire pit, along with our folding chairs and the cooler. After setting up camp and having a little bite to eat, we went exploring to see what we could see. The wildlife was amazing. We saw deer, lots of birds, and even a fox. And the trees were amazing too, tall and proud, like they were protecting the area and all its inhabitants. After exploring, we headed back to the site to start a bonfire and relax for a bit before bed. Although the weather was perfect during the day, it got really cold once the sun set. We all huddled around the fire and told scary stories, each one trying to outdo the last on the fright scale. Around 11 p.m., we put out the fire and went to our tents so we would be well rested for the next day's activities. There were 2 people for each tent. Teddy and I shared one tent while the rest of the group went to their tents. It wasn't long before everyone was sound asleep. It must have been somewhere around 1 a.m. when I heard a shrill scream come from the tent next to ours. It was my friend Lindsay, and she was screaming like crazy. We all grabbed our flashlights and went to her tent. She was backed into the corner, hugging her knees and trembling like she'd seen a ghost. We asked her what was wrong, and where her boyfriend Colin was. She pointed a shaky finger toward the other side of the tent. As we all glanced over to where Lindsay was pointing, the blood drained from our faces, and absolute horror washed over us. Lying on Colin's sleeping bag was his severed foot. While I was paralyzed in fear, the other girls were shrieking hysterically. It was utter chaos. Teddy, who was trying to keep his nerves steady, shushed us all and said, "Listen." We all got as quiet as we could and tried to listen. As we all stood like mute statues in Lindsay's tent, we noticed what sounded like something being dragged away from camp. Whatever was doing the dragging was breathing heavily and grunting like it was struggling. Then the dragging stopped, and we heard what sounded like chewing and crunching. I kept my hand on my mouth, too afraid to even breathe. I swear I didn't let out another breath until I heard the noise fade into the woods. There was no way we could stay there. Whatever was out there would come back for us without a doubt. Only grabbing stuff that we could use as weapons, we made a run for the Tahoe. There was no cell signal in this area, so we couldn't call for help. All we could do was get out of there as soon as possible. We struggled to stay focused and help those who were too scared to even think for themselves. But we managed to get in the truck and get it started. As Sarah turned on her headlights, we all let out a collective scream. About 20 feet in front of the truck was what looked like a gargoyle or some other hideous creature out of the worst movie you could think of. It was hunched over Colin's mangled body, tearing at his flesh with its gnarly, jagged teeth. Sarah got herself together long enough to hit the gas and got us out of that area. We made it to the nearest town and reported the incident to the police. They sent out a search party immediately, but all they found were strange footprints, big drag marks in the dirt, and blood. The blood, oh man. There was so much blood all around the campsite. They never did find poor Colin's body. "How much further is it?" I asked, panting heavily. "Just a little way up ahead," said Keith, my boyfriend. It felt like we had been walking for hours. I knew he liked to go off-trail, but this seemed a bit extreme to me. We blazed a trail through thick underbrush for several miles until Keith stopped in a small, picturesque clearing. He surveyed the small area with a critical eye before proclaiming that this would be our camp for the night. I was so thankful that we stopped before dark. I've never felt the urge to camp or hike, and that sentiment wasn't getting any better on this trip. But Keith was really into it, so I went along to make him happy. Besides, at some point, I'm going to drag him along on some adventure that he surely will enjoy. We cleared some brush and set up our tent. After that, it was time to gather some firewood and cook some dinner. "Damn, I'm so hungry I'd sell my grandma for a Tic Tac," I said, as I pulled out a couple cans of soup to heat up. It wasn't much, but I really needed rest more than food at that point anyway. After dinner, we decided to hang out in the tent before going to sleep for the night. We chatted about life, family dynamics, and our future together. It was good to be able to talk things through and daydream about what our future would look like. After about an hour, we were both starting to drift off to sleep, so we turned out the lantern and hunkered down in the sleeping bag for the night. Sometime in the middle of the night, we were roused out of our sleep by the sound of footsteps right outside our tent. We were both frozen in place trying to determine what could possibly be sneaking around way out here this time of night. After a few minutes, the steps seemed to head away from the tent, so Keith pulled his pistol from his backpack and told me to stay put while he went to investigate. It was a torturous few minutes sitting there in a dark tent in the middle of nowhere, waiting for him to come back. It was dead quiet at this point, and I was starting to get a bit worried. I felt panic taking over as I tried to whisper to Keith, "Babe, please come back." No answer. So I decided to stick my head out through the tent flap so I could try to see where he had gone. Just as my eyes adjusted to the little bit of available moonlight, I heard footsteps and was thankful to see Keith walking his way back into the clearing. "Nothing," he said. "Must have been an animal, a curious raccoon or something." We decided to restart the fire to help keep any curious animals away from camp, and then headed back into the tent to get some sleep before our hike back out in the morning. Keith kept his pistol out next to his bag for the rest of the night too. About an hour after we fell back asleep, I woke up and noticed that Keith wasn't next to me anymore. I started to feel the panic rush over me again, but told myself, maybe he just needed to go to the bathroom or something. He'll be right back. But he wasn't coming back. So I put on my jacket and fumbled for a flashlight from the pack so I could go out and look around. I slowly headed the direction I saw Keith come from earlier that night. The brush was thick, but I could see where someone had trampled the brush down and followed that path, such as it was. Suddenly, something crackled under my foot, and I stepped aside. Beaming my flashlight on it, I saw that it looked like a bone. It was a long bone, almost like a human femur bone. Strange, but I figured maybe it was from a long-dead deer or something like that. I pressed on while calling in my whisper yell to Keith, but there was no response. By now, I was a little turned around, so I got my bearings the best I could and found the trail again. Once back on track, I decided to head back towards the tent to see if he had made it back and was looking for me. As I made my way back to camp, I kicked something. It felt like a lightweight rock or something. I turned my light to the object and turned it over with the tip of my foot, and was horrified when I saw that it was none other than a human skull. The dark hollows where the eyes once had been just about gave me a heart attack. "Keith!" I shrieked, and ran all the way back to the tent. As I ran, I just kept yelling Keith's name, hoping that he would step out and save me from whatever was happening. At last, I found the tent and saw that there was a light inside. Apparently, Keith had returned. I could see his shadow on the tent walls moving around like he was looking for something. I breathed a sigh of relief and composed myself before I went inside. All I could think of was how silly I was being. He was really going to have a field day with this one, I thought to myself. He'll probably never let me live this down. "Sasha, what's wrong?" came the urgent voice behind me. I turned around and saw Keith standing in the path that I had just come running down. But, I stammered. "Then who's—" I pointed at the tent with my now shaky hand, and he saw the shadow too. We huddled together trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shadow moved toward the tent flaps, and we saw him unzip it. A large, ominous-looking man stepped out of the tent and turned to face us. He looked like he was wearing a mask of some sort. It looked as if it was made from skin, but not his skin. It was a horrible sight. I felt myself starting to really panic now as he raised his hand toward the sky. He was holding something in that hand. Oh God, it looks like an arm. He raised the arm to his mouth and took a huge bite right out of it like he was gnawing on a chicken wing or something. We stood there frozen in horror, and I remembered the remains I had stumbled on while looking for Keith. I started to tell Keith what I had seen as we backed away, but suddenly, the hideous man lunged toward us, making a guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "Keith, run!" I screamed, and we both shot off at top speed, leaving whatever we had behind us. Without looking back, we could still hear footsteps keeping pace with us. We ran for several miles but couldn't find where we had parked the day before, so we decided to keep running. Once we got out to the road, we stopped for a second to catch our breath and see if we could still hear the footsteps. We couldn't. Maybe we had lost him? Keith suggested we head to the truck since we knew which way to go now, so we moved quickly but stayed alert in case the creepy guy was nearby. As we came to the small clearing where the truck was parked, we heard that same carnal growl come from the edge of the woods. We ran toward the truck as fast as we could. Thankfully, Keith had kept the keys on him when we went to bed earlier that night. As we were getting in the truck, I noticed the creepy guy coming at us fast. We jumped in and Keith started the engine. He was so scared that he had a hard time getting the truck into gear. Just as he found reverse, that arm landed right on the windshield. Keith reversed into the road and threw it in drive. As he took off, the arm slid off the hood and into the road. I looked back as we made some distance and noticed the menacing figure pick it up and start gnawing on it again. To this day, we never go camping or near the woods, especially after dark.